So let's get right to it. I'm going to ask you a question. I want each of you to think of the first word that comes into your head. Don't try to there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. I'm just interested in seeing the first reaction that you have, okay? In one word, what does it mean to be an American? Freedom. Everybody have a word in their head? Don't change it. It was the first one that came in.
Freedom.
How many other people had that as their word? Interesting.
Opportunity.
Opportunity. Kind of also connected to this idea of freedom. Almost always, if you ask a group of Americans or even a group of human beings, what's the first word that comes to mind when they think of this country? It's freedom. But then if you try to unpack that a little bit further, freedom for what? Freedom to do what? Freedom from what? It starts to get a little trickier. I think you'll agree with me that if we start to try to get specific about, well, what are the freedoms that Americans and really that all human beings hold most dear, it's the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. And if you haven't seen them in a while, actually, before I put them up, I'm just curious, by a show of hands, if your life depended on it. That's a very key phrase, especially for you, Tumor Man. If your life depended on it, how many of you would be able to name all of the freedoms protected by the First Amendment right now? Okay. I won't test you. I'll trust you. Now, how many people are pretty certain they could either get them all or come close? Okay. And how many people are certain that they would not be able to do it? All right, you guys are in the right place. Well, there they are. 45 words, 5 freedoms. If you think about it, given that when it was drafted, especially the fact that it was drafted by a bunch of lawyers, the fact that a bunch of lawyers were able to get this to only 45 words is rather remarkable. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, number 1, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. 45 words, 5 freedoms. We already have agreed that, generally speaking, we know that freedom defines what it means to be an American. And yet, if we think about the tools of freedom, the tools that we have to make sure that we are seen and heard in a democracy, it's these 5 freedoms, right? I mean, arguably, you can't have any without freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, which is not necessarily just the freedom to be a Christian or a Jew or a Hindu. It's also the freedom to be an atheist. You can think of it this way. You have the right to worship one God, 30 gods, or no God. Without freedom of conscience, none of the other possibilities exist. Freedom of speech, the right to actually make your ideas and opinions heard in the public square. Freedom of the press. Here we are at the STN conference, right? Thomas Jefferson, way back when, said if he had to choose between a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, he would not hesitate to choose the latter. I'm going to say that one more time. Thomas Jefferson, 3rd president of the United States, so obviously being president and government was pretty good to Thomas Jefferson, said if he had to choose between a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, he would not hesitate to choose the latter. Why do you think he would say such a thing? A brave soul. And I don't want to just favor the people in the front row. I see you all back there, so don't just try to pretend. Yeah.
Because government isn't the only thing you can talk about in the newspapers.
Okay, because government isn't the only thing you can talk about in the newspapers. True. Why else? See, now I'm coming back here. Yeah.
Because if the government controlled the newspapers, would it be biased towards the government? Would that be news? How could we trust it?
Well, we've definitely seen that. I lived in Beijing, China for a while, and the official paper of the government was called the People's Daily, but we called it the happy paper because nothing bad ever happened in the official newspaper. It was just like positive relations were being created with other countries, people were happy. So there's definitely a danger. But Jefferson wasn't just talking about governments controlling the newspaper. He was talking about a free and robust press watching the government. Edward R. Murrow, one of the most famous journalists ever, said a nation of sheep begets a government of wolves. In other words, if no one is paying attention to what the government is doing, then I guarantee you, because they are human beings, they will start to take advantage of their power. And before we know it, the freedoms that this country was originally founded on will be taken away. That's what Jefferson thought. So we know these are important. And if you think about it, and think about public schools now, okay? Almost any major conflict in a school community, and all of the school communities that you come from, is probably a First Amendment issue, right? Dress codes, speech codes, school prayer, students rallying around the flag, teacher political speech, evolution, creationism, all of these hot-button issues that often divide communities, they're all First Amendment issues. But what I want to get across in this session is, first of all, I want to make sure that at least this group of people, we have a deeper understanding of what the First Amendment does and does not allow, because part of the reason those conflicts become so intense is that there's widespread misunderstanding about what the First Amendment is. And so out of ignorance, a lot of times what happens is people overreact. If I'm not sure if I should allow more freedom or less freedom, I'll choose less. And then the other part is, I think too many of us, we have a very overdeveloped sense of rights and a very underdeveloped sense of responsibilities. We think the First Amendment exists to give us the right to say whatever we want to say. It does not. So we're going to explore some of those limits.